number 5 we have Isle of the Dead. Directed by Mark Robson and released in 1945, Isle of the Dead is a horror film starring Boris Karloff and Ellen Drew. The movie takes place during the 1912 war as plague was spreading on a lonely Greek island, with the residents forced to quarantine. Sounds familiar. One of the people on the island is an army general, Boris Karloff, who is cut off from his troops fighting in the First Balkan War, as well as a young woman named Thea, whom an older woman accuses of being the cause of the plague. She accuses her of being a Vorbalaka, a vampiric kind of demon, and a death spree quickly erupts. I quote, "Vorbalaka, full of evil, sinful and corrupt, your hands are bloody with violence, your mouth bitter with taste of sin and corruption. You are guilty and abhorred, Vorbalka." Very creepy indeed. Now many viewers have compared this vampire classic to The Witch, but with the energy vampire from the TV version of What We Do in the Shadows. The movie focuses on the evil within, and that the things we fear most about ourselves may one day come true. This is what goes down with Karloff's character. He's a man of science and of reason, however what we quickly learn is that he wants control, and as his companions on the island begin dying, he quickly abandons his reason for superstition. This is where the comparison between the Isle of the Dead and The Witch is drawn, with Robert Eggers' movie also focusing on the evil within, and that the real threat may not be evil beings, but the horrific impulses that are awoken inside of us that you didn't think existed.
Coming in at number 4, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, 2014. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this film probably went under the radar for most people, and with a tagline stating it as the first Iranian vampire western, then I wouldn't exactly besmirch you for not taking note. But if you haven't, what you've missed out on is one of the most unnerving yet beautifully captured demonstrations of vampire cinema in recent times. Written and directed by the awesome American Iranian director Anna Lily Amirpour, and also produced by none other than Frodo Baggins himself, Elijah Wood, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night tells the tale of a lonesome vampire who stalks her prey in the fictional Iranian ghost town of Bad City. The film stars the relatively unknown actress Sheila Van, who plays the title role of the girl, who also turns out to be a corporeal vampire of legend who spends her days in lonely isolation, spooking unwitting pedestrians at night and feasting on villainous criminals just for kicks. I'm going to shoot straight, this film isn't exactly full frontal horror, but where it really shines is in its atmospheric dread and bleak demonstration of the human condition. Also, it's just really good. Next up at number 3, Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992.
Holy blood! We're strong in the Lord! In the power of His might! We're strong in the Lord! In the power of His might!
Alright, if this was a list of literature, then of course Bram Stoker's original gothic masterpiece Dracula would be at the tippity top of this list, because of course it's vampire fiction 101. But if I'm being honest, Francis Ford Coppola's silver screen adaptation, although a horror showstopper, doesn't exactly bite the same necks that other vampire movies do. But that's the downside, because the rest of this film in its own right is a fantastic depiction of our favourite hemoglobin obsessed Count Dracula. Directed by the legendary Francis Ford Coppola and released in 1992, this film emerged during a time when some of horror's greatest icons were getting a bit of a rework, to say the least. And rework it does, steering Count Dracula from a campy, cape-wielding hammer horror figure to a creature steeped in ancient history and dripping with the blood of long-lost generations. Also, did I mention that this film is absolutely stacked? Gary Oldman as Count Dracula, the incredible Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing himself, Winona Ryder in all her glory, and of course the one, the only Keanu Reeves, whose English accent in this film is the stuff of cringe legend, but it's still awesome nonetheless.
I've seen many strange things already. Bloody wolves chasing me through some blue inferno.
Coming in at number 2 spot, Interview with the Vampire, 1994.
Kill them swiftly if you will, but do it! For do not doubt, you are a killer, Louis!
And I excruciatingly pandered over where to place this film, but I think in the end I'm happy with giving it the number 2 spot. For one reason, it perfectly captures the essence of what it is to be a vampire in a much more bleak and existential way that other vampire horror films have failed to encapsulate as well as this. It's also 90s cinema at its peak, and I'm a stickler for nostalgia, so There you go. Directed by Neil Jordan with a screenplay from Anne Rice herself, based on her incredible 1976 novel of the same name, Interview with the Vampire is a tale that spans generations and manages to maintain the blood-soaked gothic horror all the way throughout. The film stars Tom Cruise as Lestat de Lioncourt, who, may I add, is fantastic at playing a psychopathic blood-sucking villain. Who knew, eh? Alongside my man Brad Pitt as Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, a plantation owner of Spanish Louisiana in 1791 who gets turned into Lestat's new vampire best friend because, let's face it, they're both pretty lonely dudes. This film is fantastic because of the seamless ancestry that it manages to weave throughout its narrative, capturing the immortality of these vicious, pale-skinned, beautiful, bright-eyed killers without breaking a sweat. Not like vampires can sweat, anyway. Or can they? Do vampires sweat? Let me know, guys. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Let the Right One In, 2008.
Nej! Du får komma in!
Oh man, I'm just going to go out and say it. I adore this film. And please watch this first before the 2011 remake Let Me In, although I will give that the credit is due because the remake is still a decent horror film. But, and it's a big but, it is pretty much a shot-for-shot remake, and well, Let the Right One In is a near perfect movie, so it's difficult not to be good. Directed by Thomas Alfredson and written by John Lindqvist, based on his novel of the same name, Let the Right One In tells the tale of 2 kids in Stockholm, Sweden, Eli and Oscar, and, well, Eli is a vampire. This film is heartbreaking and terrifying all at the same time, and it tells the tale of 2 lonely children in the bleak Swedish midwinter without pulling any punches. Despite being a film about a legendary fantasy creature, Let the Right One In manages to capture the humanity of isolation. It's violent, it's drenched in blood, it's oftentimes shocking and bleak, but it's also charming, endearing and beautifully depicted, mainly down to the on-screen relationship of Kari Hedebrand and Lena Lenderson, 2 child actors who colossusly step up to the plate and who together deliver one of the finest shared performances in horror cinema. Really guys, I cannot recommend this film enough. Let the Right One In is perhaps the finest modern vampire film ever made, and for that, it deserves the number 1 spot on this list.
Coming in at number 5, we have Underworld 6. Now this one is exciting but slightly disappointing, and you'll see why in a minute. First and foremost, the Underworld films are a series of action horror movies created by Len Wiseman, Kevin Graveau and Danny McBride, with the first movie being released back in 2003. The movies tell the story of Celine, played by Kate Beckinsale, a vampire who works as a death dealer, killing the Lycans who allegedly slaughtered her family. As it stands, there have been 5 movies in the series, including Underworld, Underworld Evolution, Underworld Rise of the Lycans, Underworld Awakening, and Underworld Blood Wars, with the 6th movie being announced back in 2017. However, a release date has not been confirmed. Now here is where things get disappointing. Kate Beckinsale has confirmed she will not be returning for the 6th installment, stating that, I quote, "It would have been a terrible movie based on the script that I read. I wouldn't return. I've done plenty of those." Savage, but respect. Also, if we're being honest, the only good Underworld movies were 1 and 2, so they better have a killer script and a phenomenal cast even come close to the original movie. But by the sounds of things, the script isn't sounding too great, especially if the star of Click, Kate Beckinsale, is turning it down. In at number 4 we have The Hunger. Directed by Tony Scott and released in 1983, The Hunger is an erotic horror film starring Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie and Susan Sarandon, with the plot centering on a love triangle between a doctor who specializes in sleep and aging research and a vampire couple. Now the film has a large LGBT following, with the movie often being played in lesbian bars, which tells you just how influential this erotic horror was to the LGBT community, with very little representation back in the 80s. The movie is a slow burn, that's for sure. However, despite that, it is stylish with a cool 80s color palette, with the narrative building to a fun and bloody conclusion. The Hunger ultimately received a mixed response, with Roger Ebert describing the movie as an agonizingly bad vampire movie, remarking that the sex scene between Deneuve and Sarandon is effective, but that the film is so heavy on set design and scene cuts that any sense of a story is lost. Despite that though, the film has been listed as a cult film, with later reviews referring to it as outrageously sleek and a cinematic work of art that has stood the test of time that deserves a new look. In at number 3 we have Let the Right One In. Directed by Thomas Alfredson and released in 2008, Let the Right One In is a Swedish romantic horror film based on the 2004 novel of the same name. The film tells the story of a bullied 12-year-old boy who developed a friendship with a vampire child in Blackeberg, a suburb of Stockholm in the early 1980s. Now this movie is a complete departure from the typical vampire convention, with Alfredson being unconcerned with horror and vampire elements, and instead toning it down and focusing primarily on the relationship between the two main characters, Oscar and Ellie, and exploring the darker side of humanity. The movie is anchored by the two young stars, Kjær Hedebrand and Lena Linderson, both of whom were selected during an open casting which was held all over Sweden. The setting of the movie is dark, snowy and isolating, with Oscar's new vampire companion becoming an unexpected resource against the neighborhood bullies. The movie is successful because Alfredson managed to display the morbid nature of a vampire while contrasting it with the face of an innocent child. It's bleak but nonetheless romantic. Let the Right One In received widespread critical acclaim, with it garnering a 98% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. With the general consensus reading, Let the Right One In reinvigorates the seemingly tired vampire genre by effectively mixing scares with intelligent storytelling. Following the release of the movie, Cloverfield director Matt Reeves signed on to write and direct an English version. However, Alfredson expressed unhappiness with this decision, stating that remakes should be made of movies that aren't very good, that gives you the chance to fix whatever has gone wrong. Despite that, the remake received very positive reviews, but nothing will ever come close to the magic of the original. In at number 2 we have Near Dark, directed by Kathryn Bigelow and released in 1987. Near Dark is a neo-western horror film that follows a young man in a small midwestern town who becomes involved with a family of nomadic American vampires. Near Dark is essentially a complicated love story about a vampire May and Caleb, the boy she falls in love with and bites one evening. However, his essence is non-violent, making May fall for him that much more. The movie is a result of Bigelow not being able to get her Western movie funded, which was said to be a departure from cinematic convention. In turn, she decided to jump on the vampire wave and combine the two genres, and it worked. Bigelow brings beauty to the visceral brutality of this nomadic vampire tribe, not to mention it is topped off with an 80s inflected score that transports the audience. With Bigelow's more recent movies such as Detroit, Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker, it really makes you miss her earlier, less serious work, with it clear that she left the genre for prestige and fame. Despite performing poorly at the box office, the film has gained a cult following over the years, a following that it truly deserves because this film is fantastic, and a departure from the classic tales of bloodsuckers we're used to seeing on screen. It currently holds an 88% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the general consensus reading, Near Dark is at once a creepy vampire film, a thrilling western and a poignant family tale with human scares in abundance. And finally, in at number 1 we have What We Do in the Shadows. Directed by Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi and released in 2014, What We Do in the Shadows is a New Zealand mockumentary horror comedy and the first installment in the What We Do in the Shadows franchise. The film stars Clement and Waititi with a plot concerning a documentary crew who follow 4 vampire roommates, Viago, Vladislav, Deacon and Peter, who share a flat in the Wellington suburb of Tiaro. All of the vampires possess supernatural powers, including levitation and the ability to transform into animals. Viago is a 369-year-old dandy from the 18th century who travelled to New Zealand in the 1910s in search of the love of his life, Catherine. Vladislav is an 862-year-old who is haunted by memories of his nemesis, the Beast, and Deacon is a 183-year-old former peddler and the young rebel of the group who was bitten by Peter, a reclusive 8,000-year-old vampire who behaves like a feral animal. Now, What We Do in the Shadows differs from classic tales of bloodsuckers by taking on the mockumentary approach and essentially humanizing the creatures, making their lives seem almost as mundane as our own. Though they possess supernatural abilities and have existed for hundreds of years, their problems and struggles are incredibly relatable, from making rent to even dating. We're vampires, they're just like us. What We Do in the Shadows is a refreshing take on the vampire subgenre, with it being completely turned on its head, and creating something brand new that we have never seen before. If you have yet to watch it, check it out. It's also now a hit series on FX.
Kicking us off at number 5, 30 Days of Night, 2007. And to be honest with you guys, I still can't understand the lack of critical acclaim that this film received, because in my book it's one of the most faithful adaptations of vampire fiction that I've ever seen. The thing that makes 30 Days of Night so endearing, without mentioning its stellar cast and performance, is that the villainous vampires in the film are so captivatingly original. They're bestial and primal in ways that horror cinema has rarely ever captured. Based on the comic book miniseries of the same name, written by Steve Niles and directed by David Slade, 30 Days of Night focuses on the small town of Barrow, Alaska, as it enters its 30-day long polar night, and it just so happens that a band of ancient vampires turn up on a ghost ship ready for an interruption-free, all-you-can-eat buffet. Josh Hartnett as Sheriff Eben Olsen absolutely knocks this film out of the park, as well as supporting roles from Melissa George, Ben Foster and Mark Boone Jr. 30 Days of Night is violent in all the right places, suspenseful in just the right amount, and a fitting tribute to the devices that make vampire fiction so damn awesome.
Coming in at number 4, we have Blade 2022. That's right, we're set to have a brand new Blade movie rumored to be hitting the big screen in 2022. The MCU announced their Phase 4 slate, which has, of course, been pushed back with COVID plaguing our lives. However, there seems to be an empty gap for a mystery movie in 2022, which many are assuming will be Blade. Now, the new Blade was announced last year at San Diego Comic-Con, with it being revealed that Mahershala Ali will be playing the title character, with the actor taking the stage to a round of applause as he donned the Blade baseball cap. Now, for those who don't know, Blade is a fictional character who hails from Marvel Comics. He is a human-vampire hybrid who aims to rid the world of evil vampires and has trained himself to become the ultimate monster hunter. As we all know, the comics were adapted into a series of movies starting back in 1998, with Wesley Snipes taking on the role of Blade. However, it is about time we had a new take on the iconic character, and I personally cannot wait for Mahershala Ali's depiction of this human vampire. Coming in at number 3, we have Dracula Reboot. Back in 1992, we were gifted with Bram Stoker's Dracula, a movie adaptation of the 1896 gothic horror novel of the same name. The novel introduced us to the character of Count Dracula, and actually went on to establish many conventions of the vampire fantasy. The novel tells the story of Dracula's attempt to move from Transylvania to England, so that he may find new blood and spread the undead curse, and of the battle between Dracula and a small group of people led by Professor Abraham Van Helsing. The movie adaptation back in 92 starred the likes of Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, Anthony Hopkins, Keanu Reeves and more, and was a hit among horror movie lovers, with some folks stating, I quote, "It was overblown in the best sense of the word. Francis Ford Coppola's vision of Bram Stoker's Dracula rescues the character from decades of campy interpretations, and features some terrific performances to boot." Now, the world is all set for a brand new take on Dracula, with director Karen Kusama, the woman behind Jennifer's Body, teasing that her Dracula will be different from other adaptations. Personally, I'm very excited for this take on Dracula, considering how great Jennifer's Body was. I have high hopes. Coming in at number 2, we have Morbius. Set to be released on March 19th, 2021, Morbius is an upcoming superhero horror film based on the Marvel Comics character of the same name. Now, the comic book series is titled Morbius the Living Vampire and was created by Roy Thomas, with the character first appearing as an enemy of Spider-Man in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 101 back in 1971. Morbius is a former award-winning biochemist named Michael Morbius, who was imbued with pseudo-vampiric superhuman abilities and physical traits after a failed biochemical experiment, which was intended to cure him of his disease. From then on, he struggles with his new persona and his insatiable lust for human blood, as well as the subsequent efforts to cure his condition. Now, the movie adaptation is set to hit the big screen next year, with Jared Leto playing the title character. It is also intended to be the second movie in the Sony Pictures universe of Marvel Comics. The movie is directed by Daniel Espinosa and also stars Matt Smith, Jared Harris and Tyrese Gibson. The movie's first trailer was released in January 2020, with it initially being set to be released in July 2020. However, some reshoots took place in February of this year, and then of course COVID happened, with production halting and the movie's release date being pushed back to March of next year, with the pandemic closing movie theaters around the world, although they are starting to reopen, which I'm very happy about. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. That is right, we're getting an interview with the vampire reboot, whether we like it or not. Personally, I don't believe this is something we need right now, with the original Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt movie being incredibly close to perfection, but honestly, with the rate that the film industry is pumping out bad horror movies, I'll take it. Now, for those who don't know, the Vampire Chronicles is a series of novels created by writer Anne Rice that revolves around the fictional character of Lestat de Lioncourt, a French nobleman turned into a vampire in the 18th century. Some of these works include Interview with the Vampire Lestat, The Queen of the Damned, The Tale of the Body Thief, Merrick, Prince Lestat, and more. Now, Interview with the Vampire was the first of Anne Rice's novels to be adapted into a movie back in 1994, with the next being The Queen of the Damned, which was adapted back in 2002. Now, a television series adaptation of the novels was announced by Hulu back in July 2018, however, these rights expired in December 2019. Jumping forward, it was announced that AMC had acquired the rights to both of the Vampire Chronicles and The Lives of the Mayfair Witches for developing both film and television projects. Now, as it stands, it seems as though instead of getting a new adaptation, we will be getting a reboot of Interview with the Vampire, which centers on vampire Louis de Pointe-de-Lac, who tells the story of his life through a reporter, beginning with his transformation into a vampire by Lestat back in 1791, with the movie chronicling their life together and the turning of 10-year-old Claudia into a vampire. Like I said before, this 1994 movie is so close to perfection that I'm nervous about anyone trying to touch it or do something different with it, but we shall see how this all unfolds in time.